Wednesday night, Jason. The doorbell rang at 9:45 that Wednesday evening, marking the beginning of my wife's secret life unraveling, though she didn't know it yet. I opened the door and found a man and a woman standing there, dressed in business attire that looked somewhat outdated and worn. Instantly, I suspected they were with the police. It wasn't just their appearance, but the timing. This was the week Chase and I had planned to set our payback scheme into motion. "Good evening, sir," the woman said. "Are you Mr. Jason Palmer?" "Yeah, I'm Jason Palmer. Who are you, and why are you here at this hour, unannounced?" I played dumb, though I had a pretty good idea where this was headed. Behind me, my wife Kira called out, "Who is it, honey?" Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. She'd been on edge all evening. Wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, she joined me at the door. The look on her face said it all. She was worried. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," I replied, forcing myself to sound calm as she stood beside me. Her frown deepened. The woman shifted her attention from me to Kira. "Are you Mrs. Kira Palmer?" she asked. The man standing next to her remained silent, looking bored as if he had somewhere better to be. "Look," I said, attempting to sound annoyed while hiding my anticipation. "You've been asking questions on my front porch without even telling me who you are or why you're here." The woman let out a sigh of resignation. She reached into her shoulder bag while her companion pulled something from the inside pocket of his jacket. In a synchronized motion, they both flashed their badges under the porch light. "I'm Detective Sergeant Hopkins, and this is Detective Curtis," the woman said. "We're investigating an assault that took place earlier today, and we need to ask both you and Mrs. Palmer a few questions." I'd practiced my look of surprise a few times in front of the mirror, and now was my chance to see if it worked. "An assault? And why would you think my wife or I know anything about it?" I asked, feigning growing irritation. I glanced at Kira, whose face had drained of all color. She looked terrified, almost on the verge of hyperventilating. Finally, the male detective spoke. "The victim sustained serious injuries earlier this afternoon. During a brief moment of consciousness before surgery, he identified Kira Palmer as a key witness. Several other witnesses also confirmed her presence at the scene. Still pretending confusion, I asked, who was this victim, and why would my wife be involved? I let my voice trail off, as though a clueless husband just starting to piece things together. The ignorant act was working well enough, for now. Detective Hopkins wasted no time. "Mrs. Palmer, what is your relationship with a Mr. Noah Myers, and why were you with him when he was attacked in the back parking lot of the Newton Motel on King Street this afternoon?" She didn't hold back, going straight for the shock factor. There was no escape for Kira now. She let out a sob and looked like she was about to faint. I turned slowly toward her, my expression one of confusion and shock. At least, I hoped I was playing my part right. My gaze shifted from surprise to concern, and then to anger as she began to cry uncontrollably, backing away from me. Friday. Chase. Fridays tend to be less chaotic than the rest of the work week, and this one was no different. I was having a relatively calm afternoon when my secretary, Alexis, informed me I had a call on line 1. I picked up the phone. "Mr. Kennedy speaking. This is Deputy Perkins from the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. I need to schedule a meeting with you, this afternoon or evening if possible," said a husky voice on the other end. "Deputy Perkins?" I responded, already sensing Jason had held up his end of the deal. "Can you tell me what this is about?" "I'd prefer to discuss it in person, Mr. Kennedy. I'd also recommend Mrs. Kennedy be there for this conversation. In fact, it's important that she is," he added rather evasively. I was glad he couldn't see the grin of satisfaction spreading across my face. "I'm confused but curious," I replied. "Of course, you can come by. How about 7 p.m.? My wife works during the day, but she'll be home by the evening." "7 p.m. works. See you then," he confirmed before hanging up. I put down the phone, stood, and took a deep, contented breath as I looked out the window. Tonight, everything comes to light, I thought. But I realized I couldn't get ahead of myself. I needed to play my role convincingly. I'd have to call home to give Bella a heads up about the deputy's visit. Otherwise, she might catch on to the setup. The home phone rang 4 times before switching to voicemail. That was unusual. Bella always picked up around this time of day. Maybe she was in the shower, or perhaps she'd run a quick errand. I waited for a few minutes, thinking she'd return and see the missed call, but when I tried again 5 minutes later, I got the same result. Voicemail. I checked my watch, debating whether to wait longer, but the nagging feeling that something wasn't right kept gnawing at me. After 10 more minutes, I left a message, doing my best to sound puzzled, concerned. "Hey Bella, it's me. I'll be home around 6:15. I got a strange call from Deputy Perkins. No idea what it's about, but I figured I should let you know we might have a visitor tonight. Just wanted to give you a heads up. See you soon." As I hung up, I couldn't help but smile. The message was perfect, calm, a little worried, like any unsuspecting husband would be. I had nailed the tone, walking that fine line between concern and confusion, hiding the quiet triumph stirring inside me. Everything was moving along as planned. Back to Wednesday. Jason. By the time the detectives left, I had already unleashed every bit of fury I had built up inside. I yelled until my throat was sore, while Kira crumbled before me, a pathetic heap of guilt and tears. It took every ounce of control I had to keep my anger verbal, to refrain from crossing that invisible line. Detectives Hopkins and Curtis stood close by, silent witnesses, ensuring Kira had protection from anything worse than my words. When I'd finished, when the anger had subsided just enough, I gave the detectives my version of events, a carefully constructed tale of ignorance and innocence. Once their questions had been answered, I retreated upstairs. I already knew what I was going to pack. I'd planned this for days, so it took only minutes to grab my clothes and toiletries, stuffing them into a suitcase with robotic precision. But the departure had to be grand, dramatic. I stomped down the stairs, suitcase in one hand, laptop and backpack in the other, the heavy thud of my footsteps echoing through the house. Kira was still curled on the sofa, her sobs muffled by her hands, the picture of regret. I didn't feel pity, only contempt. As I packed, the details of her affair had started to unravel, courtesy of the two detectives. She had been to the Newton Motel twice, both times to meet Noah Myers, her lover. But today's rendezvous had ended far worse than she'd ever expected. After they left the motel room, heading for their cars, a hooded figure emerged from behind a nearby van, catching Myers off guard as he approached his Lexus. The man, wielding a baseball bat, attacked with brutal precision. Myers didn't stand a chance. The man struck him relentlessly, breaking his ribs, fracturing his left arm, and shattering his right leg. But the worst damage was reserved for Myers' groin. The attacker made no effort to conceal himself from Kira. He didn't care that she saw everything. He simply stared at her when it was over, the bat resting casually on his shoulder, shaking his head before disappearing into the parking lot of the adjacent convenience store. Kira had stood there, frozen with terror, unable to move or scream. It wasn't until after the attacker fled that bystanders started to notice the beaten man on the ground. Some rushed to help, others stood back filming the scene on their phones. Eventually they noticed Kira, standing there like a deer in headlights, and several phones captured her, linking her to Myers. Witnesses said she panicked, fumbling with her car keys, desperately trying to unlock her Corolla. It took her several frantic attempts before she managed to get inside and flee the scene, her license plate recorded on camera as she sped off. Detectives Hopkins and Curtis recounted the rest. Myers had been barely conscious when he was rushed to the hospital. Drifting in and out, he mumbled two names, Kira and Bella. Only once did he regain enough awareness to tell the police that Kira Palmer was present at the time of the attack. Those words, uttered just before surgery, were enough to bring this nightmare crashing down around Kira. "Mrs. Palmer," Detective Hopkins had asked, her voice firm but emotionless, "can you explain what happened between you and Mr. Myers?" Kira had looked utterly defeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jason, I'm so sorry. She couldn't finish. Her voice broke and she turned away, tears streaming down her face. I had seen enough. I'd shouted at her, demanding answers, unleashing more rage. Only after my relentless yelling did she finally admit the truth. They had been at the motel for sex. And when she had the audacity to say, "It's not what you think," I nearly laughed. The nerve. The phrase right out of a cheater's playbook. That's when I had gone upstairs, packing my things, slamming drawers for effect. Everything had gone exactly as planned. I remembered it all as I left the house we had shared for 4 years. 1 year of living together and 3 years of so-called marriage. 30 minutes after the detectives arrived, I was on my way to the hotel I had already booked for the week. I needed space, not just to distance myself from Kira, but to keep the act going. More importantly, I needed to brace myself for the next part of the plan with Chase. Game time was approaching. Back to Friday. Chase. When I arrived home that Friday afternoon, fresh from the call with Deputy Perkins, there were no surprises waiting for me. Bella wasn't home. Her car was gone too. It seemed everything was falling into place. I dropped my gym bag by the door and made my way into the kitchen, grabbing a cold beer from the fridge. The wall phone blinked, signaling that my earlier voicemail had gone unnoticed, or, more likely, ignored. I took a sip from the bottle and glanced around the house, everything in its place, but something in the air felt off. There was an odd quiet, a strange sense that something was missing. Ignoring the nagging feeling, I climbed the stairs to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, tugging off my shoes. I peeled off my shirt, tossing it toward the hamper, missing by a mile. As I went to hang up my pants in the closet, something caught my eye. Bella's clothes were gone. A heavy sigh escaped me. I walked over to her dresser, opening the drawers one by one. As expected, they were empty. Her underwear, her personal belongings, all gone. It was a sight I had already anticipated, but seeing it still stirred a deep, simmering rage within me. This was it. The game was now fully in motion. When I came back downstairs after changing into some slacks, a polo shirt, and my moccasins, no socks, I finally noticed what had felt off about the den earlier. Several of Bella's knickknacks, photos, and personal items were missing. I shrugged. Good riddance, I supposed. I should have felt some kind of sadness. After all, we had spent a quarter of our lives together. But at that moment, I was still too angry to feel anything except frustration. Besides, I had a role to play when Deputy Perkins arrived. When he did, the first question came quickly. "Mr. Kennedy," Deputy Perkins asked, "when did you learn about your wife's affair with Mr. Evan Brewer?" I put on the expression I had practiced so many times, a look of confused surprise. "My wife's what? Affair? Brewer?" I repeated, sounding genuinely shocked. "You mean she's cheating on me? With who?" I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a moment as though trying to stay calm, while inside, I was laughing at how perfectly the performance was unfolding. Acting as though I had just learned about the affair, I opened my eyes and rubbed them with my forefinger and thumb, the same fingers I'd discreetly coated in Tabasco sauce just before the deputy had rung the doorbell. By now, my eyes were watering, visibly red, adding to the effect. "I guess her lover is this Brewer?" I whispered as I sat down heavily. The deputy nodded slightly. "No, I had no idea." "May I speak to Mrs. Kennedy, sir?" Deputy Perkins asked. "Perhaps she could shed some light on our investigation. Is she here? We'll need her statement as well." I shook my head, feigning dazed confusion. She's gone. When I got home, all of her things were missing. I think she left me. That's the only explanation I can come up with." This was my cue to switch gears, to morph from the heartbroken husband to the righteous, angry victim. Just when did the sheriff's office get involved in investigating wives' infidelities while their hard-working, trusting husbands are out providing for them? I stood up, pacing the room, waving my arms for emphasis, throwing in an occasional glare at the deputy, who remained unfazed by my performance. If anything, he looked mildly bored. "Mr. Kennedy," Deputy Perkins replied in a measured tone, "we don't investigate infidelity. However, we do investigate when such affairs lead to felony assault and battery, or even attempted murder." He was watching me closely as he spoke, his voice calm but probing. I threw on my best shocked husband face, channeling a silent quote from Casablanca. "I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on here." I nodded along with the charade. "Deputy, I'm stunned, absolutely stunned, to learn my wife's been unfaithful. But do you honestly think she tried to kill her lover?" Deputy Perkins almost smirked as he responded. "No, I don't suspect her of that. What we're trying to determine is who else might have had a motive, like, for example, an angry husband." The moment had come. It was time to deliver an Oscar-worthy performance. "Deputy," I began, putting on my most earnest expression, "I had no idea my wife was having an affair, and I am certainly not a violent man. When exactly did this assault happen, if I may ask?" He paused for a moment, sizing me up, clearly calculating how much information to divulge. "It happened last night, in a motel parking lot on Lone Tree Road around 8:30 p.m. There's a bar attached to the motel, and Evan Brewer was a regular there. often meeting with your wife, according to several witnesses. Last night, they had 2 drinks together. Both appeared agitated, according to the bartender. Your wife left first, and Mr. Brewer followed shortly after, heading to his car. A witness in the parking lot saw a man in a black ski mask attack Brewer, striking him across the back with what looked like a baseball bat. After Brewer went down, the assailant continued to beat him, targeting his body, especially his groin. Perkins paused here, clearly watching for my reaction, looking for some hint of guilt, shock, or even anger. I flinched, but only slightly, at the mention of cuck. But I managed to maintain my composure. My face showed only a blend of shock and innocence. The deputy continued. It's been our experience, Mr. Kennedy, that this type of attack, specifically targeting the groin, often indicates a cuckolded husband taking revenge on his wife's lover. I allowed myself a brief sigh, then leaned back, pretending to be processing all the information. Deputy, I finally said, my voice strained. I'm still trying to make sense of this. My wife, leaving me, and now finding out about all of this. Perkins nodded slightly, watching me intently, clearly waiting to see if I would crack under the pressure. I can assure you, I continued, I had no involvement in the incident you've described. The only connection I have is the one you've mentioned, my wife's involvement with Brewer. But last night, I was in my office with my office manager, Alexis Jenkins. We were working on our business tax filings until nearly 10 p.m. Alexis can confirm that. Perkins nodded again, his expression neutral. Yeah, I already spoke with her after you left your office this afternoon. She provided your alibi. Now I needed to show some anger, just enough to avoid giving anything else away. What do you mean you already spoke to her? Then what was all of this? Asking me all these questions, implying I was involved? Whoa, Mr. Kennedy, Perkins said, stepping back, his body language shifting as he leaned away, giving himself room to react in case I lost my temper. We have to cover all bases in cases like this. You have to understand, in situations like these, the aggrieved husband is usually our primary suspect, until we can confirm otherwise. And now, I assume you've confirmed otherwise? I pressed, my voice still laced with frustration, though I was careful to keep it under control. Now that you know where I was during the attack? Perkins gave a nonchalant shrug. Let's just say we're exploring other leads at this point, he said, his tone deliberately vague, as though still trying to provoke a reaction from me. I had to play the indignant card now. If you've got any further suspicions and want to ask me more questions, you can go through my lawyer. I stood my ground, glaring at him. Perkins raised his hands in a calming gesture, still the picture of composed authority. Relax, Mr. Kennedy, I don't think we'll need to go that route. By the way, if Mrs. Kennedy contacts you, I'd appreciate it if you let her know to get in touch with the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. And, of course, please notify me as well if she reaches out. He handed me his card as he spoke. That's all for tonight, Perkins continued. I'm genuinely sorry about the situation with your wife and how you found out. His words felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. With that, he tipped his Stetson, heading toward the door. As I was about to close it behind him, he turned and added, Remember, Mr. Kennedy, if you hear from her, we'd really like to speak with Mrs. Kennedy. I gave a silent nod, and he finally turned to leave. I shut the door behind him and exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over me. This time, instead of reaching for a beer in the kitchen, I went straight to the dining room, grabbing the bottle of wild turkey from the cabinet. Pouring myself a generous glass, I took a long sip and smiled to myself. Jason had come through for me, just as I had for him. Raising my glass, I muttered to the empty room, Sayonara, Bella. Next Wednesday, Chase. The Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition didn't quite fit the vibe of a divorce lawyer's office. But, hey, I was a guy, and I liked to look. I flipped through the magazine absent-mindedly while I waited for my appointment. I had already checked in with the receptionist at Logan Armstrong's office, one of the most feared divorce attorneys in Cherokee County. Her reputation for fiercely advocating for her clients, especially scorned husbands, was legendary. The word on the street was that she harbored a particular disdain for cheating wives, and her name alone sent shivers through many attorneys, judges, and even the occasional law enforcement officer. It had been a week since the whole fiasco with Bella's affair, and after she disappeared from my life, I knew it was time to take the next step. I'd called Logan's office right away, securing this appointment for today. After the call, her office had emailed me a checklist of steps to follow to protect my finances and myself. Close joint accounts, cancel credit cards, divide savings, change beneficiaries. The ugly financial side of divorce was about to begin. I'd done it all. Well, almost. One last conversation with Jason remained, but that was already arranged. I glanced at my watch, noting that I'd arrived half an hour early for my meeting. That was deliberate. Jason and I had a little dance of our own to play. As I continued flipping through the magazine, I heard the door open and someone walk up to the receptionist. "Excuse me," said a male voice I instantly recognized. "I might be in need of a good divorce lawyer." I resisted the urge to turn around, forcing myself to keep my head down, pretending not to know him. "Of course, sir," the receptionist responded, her voice as professional as ever. "How did you hear about Miss Armstrong?" She proceeded with her scripted questions, gathering information while subtly gauging the effectiveness of the office's marketing. After a few minutes of this back and forth, she told him, "Please fill out these forms and we'll work on scheduling an appointment with Miss Armstrong. Unfortunately, she's booked today and tomorrow, but we'll try to get you in by Friday." Jason's voice sounded hesitant, almost dejected. "Oh, okay," he replied. Do you have a restroom I could use?" "Certainly," she replied. "It's out the door to your left in the main hallway." That was my cue. I waited about 20 seconds before putting down the magazine and standing. "I'll just need to use the restroom myself before my appointment," I told the receptionist, giving her a polite smile. She returned the smile and nodded as I headed out into the hall. Inside the men's room, I found Jason finishing up at the urinal. I checked the only stall to ensure we were alone. As he washed his hands, I turned to face him, watching as he dried them. "You all right?" I asked quietly. Jason glanced at me with a strange smile. "Yeah," he muttered. "I'm okay. It's just... I never knew I had that much anger inside me. The way I did what I did last week. I've never heard anyone like that before." He looked away as he spoke, his voice low. Then, turning to meet my eyes, he added, "It scares me, man. It really does." I nodded and said, "Yeah, I know. Look." I needed Jason to stay focused. We now have a legitimate reason for knowing each other. Meeting at a divorce lawyer's office? It makes sense. Can you keep it together when we head back in? Jason blew out a puff of air, trying to steady himself. Yeah, I can do it." I gave him a reassuring grin. "Remember, your situation is different from mine, and we both know it. When you get to that third page of the questionnaire, the one that asks about counseling and reconciliation, you know what to do." 6 months later. Jason. I'm not usually one to hang around bars, but tonight was an exception. It was the 6-month anniversary of the little venture Chase and I had embarked on together, the one that let us both reclaim some pride. Chase had approached me out of nowhere that first time, catching me off guard. At the time, I was blissfully unaware of what was happening in my life. I had a steady job, a beautiful wife, and no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Chase had asked me to meet him after work, saying he had something I needed to know. I was skeptical, of course. He offered to buy drinks and dinner if I just listened to what he had to say. I hesitated, but I figured it might be worth my time. Maybe he was a potential client, so I agreed. That night changed everything. "He drugged her, Jason," Chase had said over and over. "You have to remember that. She didn't set out to cheat on you." Chase showed me the PI's reports, the surveillance, the photos, the transcripts, all of it. The investigation had started with his wife, Bella, but somehow it had uncovered my wife, Kira, too. I hadn't known Kira was friends with Bella, but it turned out they'd been getting closer at work. Lunches had turned into after-work drinks, and when Kira started staying out late to wind down, she had been doing it with Bella. According to the PI's report, Kira was shocked when Bella first mentioned her affair with Chase. But instead of being disgusted, she was intrigued. Kira had been reading romance novels since she was a teenager, so Bella's behavior must have seemed like some kind of real-life drama. Kira, of course, would never cheat. At least, I had thought that. But she loved hearing about Bella's adventures, promising to keep the secrets between them. The tipping point came when Bella invited 2 men to join them at the bar. Kira had wanted to refuse, but Bella welcomed them. Kira left early, uncomfortable with the situation, but Bella took the men to a motel room. The next week, the same men showed up again, Noah Myers and Evan Brewer. Kira stuck around longer this time, and while she and Bella were in the restroom, Myers slipped a drug into Kira's drink. When she returned, her coordination was off, her responses confused. Myers and Brewer helped her to a motel room next door, under the pretense of letting her lie down and recover. Chase had drilled it into my head. He drugged her. I believed him. But what bothered me more was what came after. She didn't need to go back to him a second time, but she did. She let him blackmail her, and worst of all, she didn't trust me enough to tell me what was going on. Instead, she let it fester, dragging herself deeper into a mess she couldn't escape. I took a long sip of my drink, trying to cool the anger that still simmered inside me. "It's not just that she cheated," I said. "It's that she didn't trust me enough to come to me for help. I'm her husband. It's my job to protect her. What kind of man am I if my own wife can't trust me to take care of her?" We sat in silence for a moment, staring at our drinks. "So, are you and Kira still trying to work things out?" Chase asked, swirling his glass of wild turkey. "Yeah, we are," I said, taking another pull on my beer. "I'm still pissed, but it's getting better. She's in assault trauma counseling, and we've been going to couples therapy for about 10 weeks now." Chase nodded. "You know Bella was deep into it with those guys. She probably suggested drugging Kira in the first place." "Yeah, I know. We've gone over it," I said. Then, after a pause, I asked, "Have you heard from Bella?" Chase shook his head and took a sip. "Nah, it's like she disappeared. I figure she'll resurface when her money runs out. Maybe I'll hear from her or her lawyer. Doesn't matter. Logan Armstrong already has the divorce paperwork ready. I can change the grounds from adultery to irreconcilable differences or abandonment if she stays gone long enough. Either way, I'm fine." Chase was still holding on to a lot of anger, but I could see beneath it. He still had feelings for Bella, whether he admitted it or not. Counseling had taught me that much. Anger that deep only came from someone who still cared. I raised my glass to Chase. "Here's to 6 months of getting our lives back." Chase clinked his glass against mine, "and to whatever comes next." "Well," I said with a grin, "at least you got the formal separation paperwork in, so that you're legally free to lower your wife count if need be, without getting slapped with a countersuit for adultery." Chase grinned back, raising his glass toward me. "You got that right." He took another sip and stared off into space for a few seconds. Then Chase looked over at me and asked, "So, are you and Kira finally back to doing, the deed?" I smiled and just nodded. I wasn't about to go into detail about our sex life after everything had come out. It had taken a couple of months after the dust settled before we got back to it, and only after she had been in counseling for a while. But man, the changes. Kira was practically bending over backward in her guilt-ridden efforts to make it up to me. Anything I wanted, any time I wanted it. Turns out that bastard Myers had been the first to take that hill, so to speak, but I was making the most of it now. I just had to be careful not to overdo it. Movement behind us, followed by a throat clearing, pulled our attention away from the bar. A woman stood there in a dark green cocktail dress that left little to the imagination. Ample cleavage, a high slit revealing a lot of thigh. Chase and I both stared, momentarily speechless at the sight before us. What's that British term? Oh, right, sex on legs. "So," she said with a smirk, "you two know each other, I see." Something clicked, a flash of recognition. Then it hit me. Sergeant Hopkins? As I live and breathe. Wow, I didn't expect a policewoman to look this good off duty. I tried hard to keep my tongue in check, both from saying too much about what Chase and I had done and from hanging out in obvious lust. "Actually, it's Lieutenant Hopkins now, but that's just my professional name. When I'm out with my husband, I'm simply Mrs. Perkins," she said, as a well-built man in a sharp suit joined her. I didn't recognize him, but I noticed Chase stiffen beside me. "Hello, Mr. Kennedy," the man said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I see my wife introduced herself to you." Then he turned to me, offering his hand. "Todd Perkins," he said, as I shook his hand. His grip was firm, but not overly aggressive. Chase cleared his throat. "Jason, this is Deputy Sheriff Perkins, the one I was telling you about. The guy who investigated the case with my soon-to-be ex-wife a few months back." I raised an eyebrow but kept quiet. "And I handled the investigation for the Woodstock PD involving Mr. Palmer and his wife during that same time." Lieutenant Hopkins, Mrs. Perkins, said with a slightly amused smile as she glanced between Chase and me. Chase quickly chimed in. "Jason and I met at my divorce lawyer's office. When we found out our wives knew each other and were involved with the same guys in those incidents, we stayed in touch. Now we meet up to share our misery. I took over, not wanting this to drag out. Except, Chase's wife disappeared. My wife and I are trying to patch things up. Lieutenant Hopkins' smile thinned. Well, Mr. Palmer, I'm glad to hear you and your wife are trying to work it out. By the way, we still have an open case on the attack on Mr. Myers. She paused, as if waiting for me to respond. When I just grimaced and took a long pull from my beer, she continued. He's still in rehab for his leg. It looks like he'll have a limp for the rest of his life, though his arm is recovering well enough. Good thing he's right-handed. I couldn't care less about Myers' recovery, but I just nodded. His wife, Bella, divorced him and took their 2 kids, plus a good chunk of his finances. Seems his reproductive organs, while still functional, are lacking potency. Low sperm motility means he probably won't have any more kids if he remarries. There was an edge of satisfaction in her voice. I guess even cops enjoy seeing cheating men get what they deserve. Yeah, Deputy Perkins added. And Chase, if you ever hear from your ex, let her know we're still looking into the attack on Mr. Brewer. His injuries weren't as bad as Myers's, but he's got plenty of medical bills. They came just as his wife Riley hit him with divorce papers too. Chase grunted. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Deputy Perkins and his wife exchanged looks, clearly amused, but said nothing as the silence stretched out. Well, y'all have a good night now, Deputy Perkins said, taking his wife's hand and leading her toward the door. Chase and I turned back to the bar and sat in silence for a few minutes. Then, in a low voice, Chase asked, "You did make sure to get rid of that bat, right?" Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button for more of Love, Lust, Lies.